For decades, Johnny Carson ruled late-night television with a presence no one could match. Night after night, he welcomed Hollywood's biggest names into American living rooms, charming audiences with his calm wit, effortless timing, and the unmistakable ease of a man who understood the power of national television. From his iconic desk at NBC, Carson created a stage unlike any other, one where stars relaxed, lowered their guard, and often revealed more of themselves than they ever intended. But that freedom came with a price. In a time when America's conversation about race was shifting rapidly, The Tonight Show became an unexpected window into attitudes many preferred to overlook. Jokes, comments, and offhand remarks, things that once passed unnoticed, began to expose a darker side of some of Hollywood's most beloved figures. What had once blended seamlessly into old-school entertainment now stood out sharply against a country wrestling with change. Carson, positioned between generations, felt this tension more than anyone. He grew up admiring many of the legends who sat across from him, figures shaped by an era when racist humor was simply part of the landscape. Yet he also recognized that America was evolving, and the standards of the 60s and 70s were no longer acceptable to a growing portion of his audience. The archival footage reveals a subtle shift, the polite smile tightening, the quick diversion to another topic, the discomfort he tried to hide but could never quite erase. He couldn't confront every guest, he couldn't ban half the industry, so he navigated quietly, carefully, allowing the cameras to capture moments that history would later revisit with very different eyes. Tonight, we look back at 7 guests whose appearances on The Tonight Show revealed racial attitudes far more troubling than the polished public images they carried. Moments that showed just how deeply Hollywood's biggest stars were shaped by the prejudices of their time. John Wayne. John Wayne stepped onto Johnny Carson's stage as a national symbol, an American hero whose name had become synonymous with strength, patriotism, and moral clarity. But when he appeared on The Tonight Show after his infamous 1971 Playboy interview, the audience wasn't just seeing a movie legend anymore. They were looking at a man whose own words had already revealed an ideology that shocked the nation. In that interview, Wayne openly declared his belief in white supremacy until, in his view, Black Americans were educated to a point of responsibility. It wasn't a vague remark or something ripped out of context. It was direct, intentional, and delivered confidently by one of Hollywood's most beloved icons. When he later sat across from Carson, everyone in the studio knew exactly what he had said, Carson included. Wayne didn't repeat those ideas on The Tonight Show, but the room felt different. Footage from those later appearances shows the shift clearly. In earlier years, Carson greeted him with warmth, admiration, and an almost nostalgic respect for the old Hollywood cowboy. After the interview became public, that warmth faded. Carson's smile tightened. His body leaned back slightly. His tone grew more formal. He never confronted Wayne, it wasn't his style, yet the distance was unmistakable. For viewers paying attention, the chemistry had cooled. Wayne's presence carried a contradiction the show could not hide. On screen, he represented the heroic defender of American values, a symbol of fairness and rugged honor. Off-screen, his own statements promoted ideas that disenfranchised entire communities. The disconnect left many fans stunned. How could a man who played noble, principled characters speak so casually about racial hierarchy in real life? Carson found himself trapped between respect for Wayne's legendary status and awareness of the controversy following him. Unlike modern television, where confrontation is expected, Carson's Tonight Show operated on subtlety. He managed the tension by keeping interviews light, avoiding deep topics, and maintaining professionalism without offering the camaraderie he once did. The result was an atmosphere that told its own story. Wayne didn't need to repeat his views, they already hung in the air every time he appeared. John Wayne's Tonight Show moments became more than celebrity interviews. They became historical artifacts revealing the uncomfortable truth about who he really was. Millions saw a cultural hero trying to maintain his carefully crafted image, while the man behind that image had already shown a side far darker than the iconic characters that made him famous. Number 2. Bob Hope. Bob Hope walked onto Johnny Carson's stage carrying decades of admiration from audiences who saw him as America's beloved comedian. For generations, he was the man who entertained soldiers, hosted countless specials, and represented the wholesome face of classic American humor. But behind that polished image was a long history of racial jokes, blackface performances, and stereotyped characters that reflected an era of comedy built on mocking entire communities. By the time he sat across from Carson in the 1970s and 80s, those jokes were no longer harmless nostalgia. They had become reminders of a past that many viewers were ready to leave behind. Hope came from a time when black caricatures, exaggerated Chinese accents, and ethnic stereotypes were mainstream entertainment. Unlike some performers who later acknowledged the harm caused by that style of humor, Hope resisted. He insisted that his old routines were just jokes, dismissing criticism and portraying growing racial awareness as oversensitivity. This refusal to evolve became increasingly visible each time he appeared on The Tonight Show. As social standards shifted, the gap between Hope's comedic past and the expectations of modern audiences grew wider. Footage from his Carson interviews captures the tension. Hope would occasionally slip in a racially charged quip, a mocking accent, a stereotype, a punchline built on ethnicity. In earlier decades, the audience might have laughed without hesitation, but in the later years, their reaction was more restrained. The laughter didn't come as quickly or as freely, and sometimes it didn't come at all. Viewers at home noticed the disconnect, a legendary entertainer trying to perform jokes that no longer fit the times. Carson's reactions revealed even more. He respected Hope deeply, saw him as a pioneer of American comedy, and understood his enormous influence on entertainment history. Yet Carson also recognized when a joke didn't land, or when it wasn't appropriate anymore. Instead of laughing along, he often responded with a tight smile or a neutral glance before quickly steering the conversation towards safer territory. It was his way of acknowledging the problem without embarrassing one of Hollywood's most powerful figures on live television. What made Hope's case particularly uncomfortable for The Tonight Show was his insistence that nothing needed to change. Younger comedians were moving forward, abandoning racial stereotypes for new forms of comedy, but Hope held firmly to the humor that defined his early career. This resistance didn't come from ignorance, it came from conviction. In interviews, he openly defended the routines that many viewers now found offensive. To him, criticism meant that comedy was being censored, not that certain communities had been hurt for decades. Behind the scenes, producers were instructed to keep topics light and avoid moments where Hope might revive his older material. They weren't trying to silence him, they were trying to protect the show from backlash in an era where public attitudes were rapidly evolving. Yet despite their efforts, Hope's Tonight Show appearances continued to reveal a comedian struggling to adapt to a world that no longer found his racial humor acceptable. Bob Hope remained a legend, but his legacy came with a shadow. His refusal to acknowledge the harm in his early routines and his persistence in using racial jokes long after the world had changed exposed a truth many viewers found difficult to reconcile. On Johnny Carson's stage, he wasn't just the hero who entertained millions, he was also the reminder of an entertainment era built on stereotypes that should never have been celebrated in the first place. Number 3. Charlton Heston. Charlton Heston stepped onto Johnny Carson's stage as one of Hollywood's most commanding figures. He was the face of epic cinema. Moses, Judah Ben-Hur, the defiant astronaut in Planet of the Apes. His voice, posture, and presence carried the weight of a man who had built an entire career on portraying heroes who fought for justice. Yet by the time he appeared on The Tonight Show during his later years, Heston's public identity had shifted from celebrated actor to political warrior, and some of his strongest opinions placed him in direct conflict with the growing national conversation about race. Heston's transformation became most visible when he rose to a leadership role in the National Rifle Association. As he grew more politically outspoken, his views on civil rights increasingly disturbed many of his peers. He often dismissed systemic racism, describing it as a relic of the past rather than a present-day reality, and characterized civil rights activists as overreacting or exaggerating the challenges minorities still faced. These statements didn't come from offhand moments. They became a consistent part of his speeches, interviews, and public appearances. Carson understood exactly how polarizing Heston had become. Unlike earlier decades, when Heston's visits focused on films, storytelling, and old Hollywood memories, his later Tonight Show appearances required careful navigation. Carson had no interest in turning his show into a political battleground, but he also couldn't ignore the fact that one of his most recognizable guests was expressing views about race that many viewers found troubling. Behind the scenes, Tonight Show staff confirmed that Carson quietly instructed his writers to steer conversations away from political topics, especially anything that might give Heston an opening to expand on his racial beliefs. They prepared lighter segments, stories from movie sets, reflections on classic films, humorous memories, to keep the interviews safe and contained. It wasn't about silencing Heston, it was about preventing the kind of on-air controversy that could damage the show or alienate millions of viewers. Still, even with careful planning, tension sometimes seeped through. Heston's confidence bordered on stubbornness, and his dismissive comments about modern civil rights movements were well known among people who worked with him privately. Although he rarely expressed these views bluntly on The Tonight Show, staff members recalled his backstage remarks, which occasionally included stereotypes and generalizations that reflected a worldview stuck decades behind the times. These private moments created an unsettling contrast with the noble characters he embodied on screen. Carson responded the only way he knew how, by maintaining cordial professionalism while keeping emotional distance. The warmth he showed toward other Hollywood veterans was noticeably cooler when speaking with Heston in later years. His body language, his pacing, and his transitions all suggested that he respected Heston's career but felt increasingly uneasy about his evolution into a political figure whose beliefs no longer aligned with the direction America was moving. Charlton Heston's Tonight Show appearances became symbolic of a larger issue in Hollywood: how to handle legendary actors whose contributions to film were undeniable, yet whose personal beliefs clashed with a society becoming more aware of racial injustice. He wasn't shouting slurs or performing offensive comedy. His racism was quieter, rooted in dismissal, denial, and the refusal to acknowledge systemic inequality. That subtlety made it even more difficult to confront. On Carson's stage, Heston embodied the gap between the roles he played and the views he held. He portrayed liberators, prophets, and heroes determined to free the oppressed. Yet in real life, he grew increasingly critical of the very movements fighting for equality. To millions watching at home, the contradiction was impossible to overlook. Number 4. Don Rickles. Don Rickles walked onto Johnny Carson's stage with the energy of a man who feared nothing. Not criticism, not controversy, and certainly not the boundaries of acceptable humor. Known as Mr. Warmth in an ironic twist only Hollywood could invent, Rickles built an entire career on insult comedy that targeted anyone within reach. But the shock came from who he targeted and how far he was willing to go. Racial jokes, ethnic stereotypes, slurs that would end a career instantly today. Rickles didn't just cross lines, he ran over them, laughed, and then crossed them again. His comedy wasn't subtle. On stage, he mocked black guests, Asian guests, Jewish guests, and anyone whose background he could turn into a punchline. He once called Sammy Davis Jr. a spear chucker, a slur so blatant that almost any other comedian would have been blacklisted instantly. Yet Rickles wasn't blacklisted. Somehow, he lived inside a strange bubble where audiences let him get away with what they condemned in others. Even the very people he insulted, Sammy Davis Jr. included, often laughed along, unable to decide whether to call him a friend or a threat. For Johnny Carson, Rickles was both a favorite guest and a constant source of anxiety. Carson genuinely enjoyed Rickles' chaos, his unpredictability, and the electric energy he brought to The Tonight Show. But as the country evolved and racial awareness increased, Rickles' material became a ticking time bomb. Carson knew it, producers knew it, the audience sensed it too. One wrong word, one of the slurs Rickles used freely in nightclubs, could put The Tonight Show in the center of a nationwide scandal. Behind the scenes, Carson reportedly warned the staff, "If he says that word again, we're cutting to commercial." It was an unspoken rule that Rickles was allowed more freedom than other guests, only as long as he stayed within limits the network could tolerate. Even so, Rickles pushed those limits constantly. He delivered jokes that made the audience laugh uncomfortably, unsure whether to enjoy his fearlessness or cringe at the stereotypes he was normalizing. The defense Rickles often received, that he insulted everyone equally, didn't erase the reality that many of his jokes targeted marginalized communities for traits they couldn't change. While he mocked powerful white celebrities for their personalities or careers, he mocked minorities for their identities. That imbalance became increasingly impossible to ignore as America's understanding of racism evolved. Carson's way of handling Rickles revealed the host's inner conflict. He admired Rickles deeply and considered him a close friend, yet he knew the show couldn't become a stage where harmful stereotypes were treated as entertainment. Whenever Rickles crossed a line, Carson responded with a quick subject change or a sharp look, signaling that the joke had gone too far. It was a delicate dance, protecting a friendship while defending a show seen by millions. Rickles represented a fading era of comedy, one built on shock value, stereotype-driven humor, and the belief that offending people was proof of bravery. But bravery isn't the same as cruelty, and audiences gradually realized that many of Rickles' jokes weren't just edgy, they were damaging. His Tonight Show appearances became historical reminders of a time when racism could be disguised as comedy, and a charismatic performer could convince the world to laugh at what should never have been funny. Number 5. Bert Reynolds. Bert Reynolds walked onto Johnny Carson's stage as one of the biggest stars on the planet. Charming, handsome, effortlessly funny, he brought an energy that seemed impossible not to like. To millions, he represented the new face of Hollywood masculinity. Confident, playful, sharp-tongued, and unafraid to make fun of himself. But behind the charm was a more complicated truth. Growing up in the segregated South during the Jim Crow era left him with blind spots he didn't always recognize or control, and those blind spots occasionally surfaced in ways that shocked viewers who adored him. Reynolds wasn't a habitual offender like some of Carson's other problematic guests. He didn't build a career on racist humor or perform offensive routines as a defining part of his act. His issues were more subtle, moments rather than patterns, but those moments were clear enough to draw public backlash. The most notable came from a Tonight Show appearance in 1978 when Reynolds made a series of jokes about Native Americans. What he saw as harmless teasing was, for many viewers, a painful reminder of decades of stereotyping and disrespect. Back then, people didn't fire off tweets or online protests. They wrote letters, hundreds of them, and they sent those letters straight to NBC. Carson took the complaints seriously. By that point, he understood that America was changing, and certain jokes could no longer be brushed off as entertainment. Instead of confronting Reynolds on air, Carson handled it quietly but decisively. He had the entire segment pulled from reruns for years. That choice spoke volumes. In Carson's world, where reruns were valuable and carefully curated, removing a segment was as close as The Tonight Show came to admitting this crossed the line. What made Bert Reynolds a particularly complicated figure was the gap between his public persona and these occasional lapses. In most interviews, he projected warmth and seemed far more open-minded than many Hollywood men of his generation. He worked with diverse casts, stood up for colleagues, and rarely displayed the rigid conservatism that defined some of his peers. His problematic comments felt less like ideology and more like inherited habits. Echoes of the environment he grew up in, slipping out despite his attempts to be better. Even so, the damage was real. Native American communities had long been mocked, dismissed, or portrayed through offensive stereotypes in Hollywood films, and Reynolds' jokes during that Tonight Show appearance reinforced a pattern they had spent decades fighting against. The complaints weren't about a single punchline, they were about history. Carson's evolving reactions made the shift obvious. He still liked Reynolds and enjoyed their easy rapport, but after the incident, his tone grew more cautious. Their interviews became lighter, safer, more controlled. It wasn't hostility, it was awareness. Carson understood Reynolds' charm wasn't enough to protect the show from backlash if another careless remark slipped through. Bert Reynolds' case became a reminder that racism on television didn't always come from overt hatred or deliberate cruelty. Sometimes it came from casualness, from people who were loved, admired, and celebrated, yet carried fragments of a world that had trained them to think certain jokes were harmless. His appearances on The Tonight Show showed the uncomfortable truth. Even the most charismatic stars could reveal parts of themselves that audiences didn't expect and didn't forgive easily. Number 6. Red Skelton. Red Skelton arrived on Johnny Carson's stage as a living monument to classic American comedy. He wasn't just another entertainer, he was a bridge to the earliest eras of show business, a performer who had conquered vaudeville, radio, film, and television long before many Tonight Show viewers were even born. Carson grew up watching him. He admired him deeply. To have Skelton sitting in the guest chair was to have the history of American comedy placed directly under the studio lights. But that history came with shadows that became harder to ignore as the country changed. Skelton rose to fame during a time when blackface performances and racist caricatures were standard entertainment. He didn't merely participate in those traditions, he embraced them. His early career depended on minstrel-style humor that mocked African Americans through exaggerated stereotypes, dialects, and visual portrayals that today are recognized as deeply harmful. While some comedians from that era later acknowledged the damage their early routines caused, Skelton refused. He saw the backlash not as a necessary correction, but as an attack on comedy itself. When he appeared on The Tonight Show in the 1970s and 80s, those attitudes occasionally resurfaced. During interviews, Skelton expressed frustration that networks were becoming too sensitive about racial content. He criticized the restrictions placed on certain jokes, insisting that old routines were harmless traditions being destroyed by political correctness. But for many in the audience, those routines weren't harmless. They symbolized decades of mockery and dehumanization. Carson's discomfort during these moments was unmistakable. He respected Skelton deeply. The admiration was genuine. But he also understood that the world was moving forward. Each time Skelton defended minstrel humor or dismissed concerns about racial sensitivity, the atmosphere in the studio shifted. Carson's smile tightened. His responses shortened. When Skelton pushed too far, Carson quietly redirected the conversation, steering it toward safer topics, classic TV memories, clown routines, or harmless anecdotes from early Hollywood. What made these moments especially tense was the audience's changing reaction. In earlier decades, Skelton's jokes could bring a room to tears with laughter, but during his later Tonight Show appearances, many viewers stopped laughing. The silence wasn't hostile, it was discomfort, a sign that the country no longer found these ideas amusing. The disconnect between Skelton's nostalgia and the audience's awareness created one of the most noticeable generational divides The Tonight Show ever displayed. Behind the scenes, NBC executives recognized the problem as well. They admired Skelton's contributions to American entertainment, but feared the backlash that could follow if he repeated the more explicit parts of his old routines. Studio staff prepared carefully for his visits, avoiding topics that might encourage him to revisit racially insensitive material. They weren't trying to erase his legacy, they were trying to protect a modern audience from harmful ideas rooted in a different era. Red Skelton's Tonight Show appearances ultimately represented the collision between old Hollywood and a society rethinking its relationship with race. He wasn't malicious, he wasn't trying to offend, but his refusal to acknowledge the harm in his early work showed how deeply normalized racist entertainment once was, and how resistant some performers were to letting it go. For millions watching at home, Skelton's interviews became a reminder of a painful truth. Not every beloved legend aged gracefully with the world around them. Number 7. Buddy Hackett. Buddy Hackett walked onto Johnny Carson's stage like a man determined to stay exactly who he had always been, no matter how much the world changed around him. Known for his rubbery expressions, unpredictable delivery, and high-energy nightclub style, Hackett represented an era of comedy built on shock value and rapid-fire punchlines. But as The Tonight Show moved into the 1970s and 80s, that old-school humor collided head-on with a country becoming increasingly aware of racial sensitivity. Hackett did not bend, he did not apologize, he did not evolve, and that made him one of Carson's most difficult guests. Unlike some entertainers who occasionally slipped into outdated comments, Hackett relied heavily on racial and ethnic jokes, on stage, off stage, and sometimes on national television. His routines included slurs, exaggerated accents, and stereotypes that were already considered inappropriate by the standards of the time. Within the comedy community, he became known as the performer who would never stop telling World War II-era jokes, long after everyone else had abandoned them. That stubbornness wasn't a secret, it was part of his identity. For Carson, Hackett posed a constant risk. The host genuinely liked him and respected his talent, but also understood how dangerous Hackett's material could be on a broadcast watched by tens of millions of people. The wrong word could trigger a national scandal, and Hackett wasn't the kind of guest you could simply trust to stay within safe boundaries. One night in the mid-1970s, the breaking point came. Hackett delivered a routine that leaned so heavily on racial stereotypes that NBC received a flood of complaints. Viewers weren't laughing, they were outraged. The backlash was fierce enough that Carson made an unusually direct decision. He bans that specific routine from ever airing again. It was one of the rare times Carson openly intervened in the creative content of a guest he admired. Behind the scenes, staff members confirmed that Hackett required constant monitoring. They developed detailed guidelines for his appearances, nudging the conversation toward harmless topics and away from anything that might invite one of his racially charged stories. Even then, there was no guarantee he wouldn't veer off script. Carson's body language during those episodes said everything. He leaned forward nervously, interrupted more than usual, and jumped in quickly whenever Hackett approached sensitive material. Hackett, for his part, insisted that his humor was harmless. He argued that he targeted everyone, not just minorities, and that audiences were too sensitive compared to the world he grew up in. But that defense ignored the deeper issue, the way his jokes reinforced stereotypes that caused real harm. His material didn't punch up at powerful people. It often punched down at communities already fighting to be treated with dignity. As America's understanding of racism evolved, Hackett's refusal to adapt became a symbol of the comedy world's most stubborn resistance to change. He didn't just belong to a different era, he was determined to stay there, no matter how uncomfortable it made the audience or the host sitting across from him. His appearances on The Tonight Show became reminders of a painful truth. Some performers weren't simply shaped by the racist culture of their time, they continued to carry it proudly, even when the world had begun to move on. And in the bright lights of Carson's studio, that refusal to grow was impossible to hide. These appearances pulled back the curtain on the prejudices hiding behind Hollywood's polished image, revealing the uncomfortable truths many tried to forget. If you want more real stories, more hidden histories, and more dark realities from behind the fame, make sure to follow and subscribe so you never miss the next episode.